You're not falling apart. You go to work, you answer messages, you make plans. From the outside, your life looks fine. And that's exactly what makes this so hard to name. There's something wrong. Not with your health, not with your relationships, not with anything you could point to on a list. Just a persistent, low-grade sense that reality is slightly off. Like you're living in a version of your life that's almost right but isn't. Like you're watching yourself from a small distance and wondering when it's going to start feeling real. You've probably tried to diagnose it. Burnout, maybe. Anxiety. Doom scrolling. Too much screen time. Not enough sleep. Not enough sun. And maybe those things are true, but they don't explain the feeling. They're symptoms of a symptom. Surface answers to a question that runs much deeper. Here's what no one is telling you. What you're experiencing might not be a personal problem at all. That unease, that diffuse, objectless wrongness, has a name. British cultural theorist Mark Fisher called it hedonic depression, the condition of living in a world that offers infinite access to pleasure while systematically destroying the capacity to actually feel it. You can watch anything, eat anything, buy anything, distract yourself indefinitely. And yet, something is missing. Not something you lost, something that was never there to begin with, or something that was quietly taken while you were busy consuming. Fisher spent his life mapping the psychological wreckage of late capitalism. Not the dramatic suffering of poverty or war, but the subtler, more insidious damage. The creeping numbness, the exhaustion without cause, the sense of living in a present that has no exit. He called the system that produces this feeling capitalist realism, the condition in which capitalism presents itself as the only possible reality, making it easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine a different way of organizing human life. That's not a metaphor. That's a description of where you actually live. By the end of this video, you'll understand why that feeling is not a malfunction. You'll understand what produced it, why it's getting worse, and what it actually means to live inside a system that has colonized not just your economy, but your imagination, your sense of time, and your capacity for joy. This will not be comfortable. It's not meant to be. The discomfort is the point, because the first thing this feeling wants you to do is look away. And that's exactly what we're not going to do. You already know something is wrong with the story you've been told about happiness. The story goes like this. If you have your health, a job, people who love you, and enough money to get by, you should feel okay. Maybe not ecstatic, but okay. Stable. Functional. And if you don't, the problem is yours to fix. See a therapist. Exercise more. Practice gratitude. The infrastructure of your life is sound. The fault must be in your attitude. But what if the infrastructure itself is the problem? Mark Fisher identified a psychological condition he called hedonic depression, and it's unlike anything previous generations had a name for. It's not the depression of loss, of grief, of a life that fell apart. It's the depression of a life that is, by every measurable standard, intact and still feels hollow. The capacity to access pleasure is fully operational. The capacity to feel genuine joy has gone quiet. You can scroll for 3 hours and feel nothing. You can eat well, watch something you supposedly enjoy, talk to someone you love, and still surface from all of it with a vague sense of having been nowhere. This is not laziness. This is not ingratitude. Fisher's argument was precise. Hedonic depression is not a personal failure. It is a rational psychological response to a specific set of conditions. When a system commodifies every human experience, when rest becomes a productivity strategy, when friendship becomes networking, when leisure becomes content, it doesn't just change what you do, it changes what things feel like. The texture of experience itself becomes thin. You're always consuming, never arriving, always optimizing, never present. The mechanism works perfectly. The feeling of being alive does not. You feel this most sharply in moments that should mean something. A vacation that feels like a photo shoot. A celebration that feels like a performance. A conversation where you're half present because the other half of you is already composing the memory of it. You're not broken. You've been trained to process your own life as a product. And products don't feel like anything. They're meant to be used, reviewed, and replaced. What Fisher understood is that this condition doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a crisis. It seeps in. It becomes the ambient temperature of your existence, so constant that you stop noticing it and start assuming it's just what being alive feels like. That assumption is the most dangerous part, because once you accept numbness as normal, you stop looking for the cause. You stop asking what produced this. You manage symptoms and call it mental health. But the numbness has a source, and it's not inside you. It's in the structure of the world you've been handed, a world built to keep you consuming, scrolling, and too anesthetized to ask what you've actually lost. What you've lost is the future. And that's exactly where we're going next, into the specific, devastating way that the future itself was taken from you, and what Fisher called the haunting that replaced it. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. Every generation before yours believed, at some level, that tomorrow would be better than today. Not naively, not without suffering or doubt. But underneath it all, there was a structural assumption baked into the culture. That history moved forward, that children would have more than their parents, that effort accumulated into something. Progress was the invisible grammar of modern life. You didn't have to think about it. It was just the tense in which existence was conjugated. You don't have that. And it's not pessimism. It's not a bad attitude or a failure of imagination. You know, not as a fear, but as a near certainty that the future will be harder. The climate is not a distant threat. It's a scheduled emergency. Home ownership, for most people your age, has shifted from a milestone to a fantasy. The social contracts that structured your parents' lives, work hard, build security, retire with dignity, have been quietly voided. No one announced it. The terms just changed. Mark Fisher had a name for what fills the space where the future used to be. He called it hauntology, a concept he borrowed from Derrida and rebuilt around a very specific cultural feeling. The sense that you are being haunted not by the past, but by futures that never arrived. The jetpacks, the space colonies, the utopia that technology was supposed to deliver. You grew up in the era that was supposed to be the future, and it looks nothing like what was promised. It looks like bureaucracy, precarity, and an endless scroll of content recycled from the decades before you were born. This is why nostalgia feels so strange now. You're not just nostalgic for things that happened. You're nostalgic for things that were supposed to happen, for versions of the future that got cancelled, for a world that felt like it was going somewhere, even if you never lived in it. That ache, diffuse, hard to locate, impossible to justify to someone who hasn't felt it, is grief, real grief, for futures that were promised and never delivered. The cruelty of this condition is that society offers no ritual for it. You can mourn a person. You can mourn a relationship, a home, a version of yourself. But mourning a future that never came, there's no language for that, no ceremony, no permission. So you carry it unnamed, and when it surfaces as heaviness or disconnection, or that persistent sense that something is fundamentally off, you assume the problem is yours. You pathologize your own lucidity. Fisher's insight was unsparing. The collapse of the future is not a mood. It's a political condition. A system that cannot imagine its own end has no interest in your future. only in your present consumption. And when the future disappears, something else disappears with it. The feeling that what you do now means anything beyond now. That hollowness isn't existential weakness. It's the correct emotional response to living in a permanent present with no horizon. And that permanent present, that flattened, looping, exitless now, is exactly where we're going next. There is a specific moment you probably recognize. You're at dinner, or watching something you chose, or in a conversation with someone you care about, and you're not quite there. Not dissociating, not checked out, just slightly removed, like there's a pane of glass between you and your own experience. You probably blamed yourself for it. Distraction, phone addiction, inability to be present. And maybe those things are part of it. But Fisher's diagnosis goes deeper. What you're experiencing isn't a habit problem. It's the logical consequence of living in a reality that has been almost entirely mediated, performed, and packaged. Think about what your life actually looks like from the outside. Not your life, the version of your life that exists on screens, the photos, the check-ins, the opinions, the aesthetic. At some point, and you probably can't identify exactly when, you started experiencing your own existence with a faint awareness of how it would appear. Not to be vain, just because that's how the infrastructure works. You live, and simultaneously, you produce the record of living. The experience and its documentation have become so entangled that it's almost impossible to feel one without the ghost of the other. This is what Fisher meant by the collapse of the real. When everything is mediated, when reality arrives pre-filtered, pre-framed, pre-optimized, it stops feeling like reality. It feels like content. Your joy becomes a story about joy. Your grief becomes a post about grief. Your life becomes a performance for an imaginary audience that never stops watching, because you've internalized it so completely that it watches even when no one else is. You're not living your life. You're curating it. And curated things don't feel alive. Fisher borrowed the concept of the simulacrum, the copy that has replaced the original so thoroughly that no one can remember what the original was. You're not watching a representation of life. You're watching a representation of a representation. The real thing is somewhere underneath all of it, but you've lost the habit of reaching for it. The mediated version is faster, smoother, more immediately satisfying. The real version requires presence, and presence has become genuinely difficult. This is not a character flaw. It is the designed output of systems that profit from your disengagement from unmediated experience. Every hour you spend processing reality through a screen, rather than encountering it directly, is an hour that feeds something other than you. The platforms are not neutral infrastructure. They are environments engineered to make the mediated feel more real than the real. And they are extraordinarily good at it. The result is a specific kind of loneliness that has no clean name. You can be surrounded by people and feel it. You can be in the middle of something that should matter and feel it. It's the loneliness of someone who suspects they haven't truly arrived anywhere in a very long time. And underneath that loneliness is something Fisher identified as one of the deepest wounds of late capitalism: the systematic destruction of the self that exists when no one is watching. But before we get there, we need to talk about the cruelest trick the system ever pulled, convincing you that all of this is your fault. At some point, the system solved its most dangerous problem. The dangerous problem was this: if enough people recognize that their suffering has a structural cause, they might do something about the structure. They might organize. They might refuse. They might imagine something different. So the system did something elegant and devastating. It privatized the suffering. It took every wound that was collective and handed it back to you as a personal deficiency. You can't afford rent. That's a housing crisis produced by decades of deliberate policy. But the story you were given is that you didn't work hard enough, didn't save early enough, made the wrong choices. The crisis disappears, the shame stays. And shame is extraordinarily effective at keeping people isolated because you can't build solidarity around something you believe is your fault. Fisher called this one of the core operations of neoliberalism, the systematic individualization of systemic problems. It doesn't just shift blame, it shifts the entire frame of perception. Once you've accepted that your suffering is a personal failure, you stop looking for its actual source. You look inward instead. You optimize, meditate, journal, reframe. You become a very dedicated manager of a wound that someone else inflicted. This is the logic behind the mental health industry as it currently functions. Fisher was not against therapy. He was against the way therapy gets deployed as a substitute for structural change. When burnout becomes an individual diagnosis rather than an indictment of working conditions, the conditions remain untouched. When anxiety is treated as a brain chemistry problem rather than a rational response to precarity, the precarity remains untouched. The treatment manages the symptom. The cause goes on producing more patients. Look at what you've been asked to carry: the weight of a collapsing climate, yours to solve through personal consumption choices; the weight of economic precarity, yours to fix through hustle and self-optimization; the weight of social isolation, yours to address through apps and networking. Every crisis that requires collective action gets handed to you as an individual homework assignment. And when you fail to solve it alone, which you will, because it was never yours to solve alone, the conclusion is that you are not enough. You have internalized a verdict that was never based on evidence. The exhaustion you feel is not weakness. It is the entirely predictable result of being asked, your entire life, to carry weight that no single person was built to carry. The numbness is not apathy. It is the psychological immune system doing its job, shutting down what it cannot process so you can keep functioning. Fisher wanted something harder than self-compassion. He wanted you to see the mechanism clearly. Not so you could feel better about yourself, but so you could stop cooperating with your own diminishment. Because once you understand that the problem is structural, the question changes completely. It's no longer, what is wrong with me? It becomes something far more uncomfortable and far more honest. And that question, and what Fisher believed you could actually do with it, is where we're going now. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. Here is the trap Fisher refused to fall into, and the one most people fall into the moment they understand what he was saying. The trap is this: you learn that the problem is structural, and you conclude that nothing you do matters. The system is too large, too entrenched, too total. You are too small. So you do nothing, or you perform outrage online, which is a more sophisticated version of doing nothing. You trade the paralysis of self-blame for the paralysis of helplessness. And the system, which needs you passive either way, is equally satisfied. Fisher didn't offer that exit. He was not interested in despair as a resting place. What he argued, carefully, without sentimentality, is that resistance begins with the act of naming. Not naming as therapy. Naming as political act. When you say out loud to another person that you feel this wrongness and you suspect it isn't yours alone, something shifts. Not in the system, not yet, but in the isolation the system depends on. Shared recognition is the first crack in the architecture of individualized suffering. You find that the person across from you has been carrying the same unnameable weight, and suddenly it has a different quality. It was never personal. It was always structural, and structural problems, unlike personal failings, can be addressed collectively. This is why Fisher loved what he called small communisms, pockets of life deliberately organized outside market logic. not ideology. Practice. You cook for people without expecting anything back. You share resources with neighbors. You build a book club, a community garden, a weekly dinner that belongs to no platform and generates no content. These are not solutions to capitalism. Fisher knew that. But they are interruptions, moments where the logic of transaction and optimization is suspended, and something older and more human takes its place. Each one is a reminder that another register of existence is possible. That reminder matters more than it sounds. Reconnecting locally and physically is not nostalgia. It is a direct counter to atomization, the process by which the system isolates you into a unit of consumption. The antidote to that isolation is not digital connection, which the system has already colonized. It is physical presence. The irreducible fact of being in a room with another person, without an agenda, without a screen between you. That experience has become so rare that it now carries an almost shocking intimacy. That shock is information. It tells you how far you've drifted from what actually sustains you. Fisher also understood that you need containers, structures that hold time and give it shape. Ritual. Not religious ritual necessarily, but deliberate repetition that marks the passage of time and creates meaning through recurrence. A walk you take every Friday, a meal you cook on Sundays, a practice that belongs to no productivity system and serves no optimization goal. These are not self-care hacks. They are psychological anchors in a culture that has deliberately dismantled every structure that once gave time its texture. None of this is enough. Fisher would be the first to say so. Individual acts of resistance do not dismantle systems, but they do something the system cannot afford. They keep your inner life alive. They preserve the part of you that can still feel the difference between real and simulated, between presence and performance, between a life and a lifestyle. And that preservation is not trivial, because the capacity to imagine something different depends entirely on the capacity to feel that what currently exists is not enough. Which brings us to the hardest thing Fisher ever asked anyone to sit with. Here is the thing Fisher spent his life trying to say, and that the culture spent his entire lifetime trying to drown out. The feeling you have, that persistent, low-grade, objectless wrongness, is not a symptom of your failure to adapt. It is a symptom of your refusal to fully disappear. Something in you kept resisting the anesthesia. Something in you kept noticing the gap between what life was supposed to feel like and what it actually feels like. And instead of being recognized as a form of clarity, that noticing was handed back to you as a diagnosis, as a deficiency, as proof that you needed fixing. You don't need fixing. What Fisher understood, and what cost him enormously to keep understanding in a culture that punishes that kind of clarity, is that the malestar you feel is a sane response to an insane set of conditions. A system that has destroyed the imaginable future, commodified every human experience, atomized community into isolated units of consumption, and then handed each person the bill for the damage it caused. That system should produce exactly what you feel. The numbness, the unreality, the exhaustion without a specific cause, the grief for things you can't quite name. These are not malfunctions, they are accurate readings. This is the hardest truth of everything we've covered. Your suffering is not the problem. Your suffering is the signal. The problem is a culture that has no framework for collective grief, no tolerance for structural critique, and no interest in letting you sit with the signal long enough to understand what it's telling you. So it offers you content instead. Distraction. A new series, a new purchase, a new optimization strategy. Anything to keep you moving fast enough that the signal stays below the threshold of consciousness. And mostly, it works. You stay numb enough to function and just uncomfortable enough to keep consuming, because the system has learned that mild, chronic dissatisfaction is the perfect engine of demand. Seeing this clearly does not make you free. Fisher never promised that. Naming the cage does not open it, but it changes something fundamental in your relationship to it. You stop cooperating with the verdict that you are the problem. You stop spending your finite energy trying to fix what was never broken in you. And you start, slowly, imperfectly, without a roadmap, redirecting that energy toward what actually matters, toward the people in front of you, toward the things you make and share outside the logic of the market, toward the small, stubborn acts of solidarity that the system cannot fully absorb. Fisher died in 2017 at 48. He left behind a body of work that was, at its core, an act of loyalty to everyone who had ever felt this wrongness and been told it was their own. This video is a continuation of that loyalty, not because the answers are here, they aren't, but because naming the thing together is itself a form of resistance. You felt something real. You weren't wrong to feel it. And the fact that millions of people feel it simultaneously, in isolation, each convinced it's their private failure, that is the most important political fact of our moment. If any of this landed somewhere real for you, say so in the comments. Not to perform it, just to break the isolation by 1 degree. And if you want to keep going, if you want to understand the deeper psychological structures underneath everything we've talked about today, the next video is waiting. Don't stop here.